Okay, we are starting our CMSA colloquium. Today, we are very pleased to have Surya Ganguli as our speaker. Surya's educational background is very broad, but it would probably be fair to say that it crystallizes around theoretical physics, with undergraduate degree from MIT, followed by a doctoral degree from Berkeley, where Surya worked on string theory. Now he's a professor at Stanford and a research scientist at Google Brain. These days, Surya applies his intellect to problems on the interface of theoretical neuroscience and machine learning. And in his today's talk, Surya plans to talk about all of the areas just mentioned. Surya, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sergey. So let me just share my screen and make sure that's okay. Okay, great. So hopefully you can all see my screen and hear me. Let me know if not. Let me okay, great. Yeah, so I was going to talk about kind of a selection of things. I know this is a very diverse institute, and I was looking over your web pages, and it looks like a fantastic place, a fun place to do research with so many diverse interests. So let's see. This always happens. Sorry, one second. My screen is not letting me share. 1 second. Let me try something else. Let me try sharing my desktop. Okay, great. There we go. So, so part of my work involves sort of working very closely with experimental neuroscientists, in a tight cycle of theory and experiment. And we've worked on a whole bunch of things like, how does the retina process natural scenes? How does the fly detect motion? Why do grid cells appear in the brains of mice and bats and many other species? How do monkeys reach? How do genetically modified mice learn, and so forth? So there's a bunch of work that I do that tightly interacts with experimental neuroscience, actually. I won't talk about that work as much today, but I was going to talk more about work that intersects with machine learning and theoretical neuroscience. And there's a reason for that. I don't view that as separate from my other work. We're kind of all in the game of neuroscience because we'd like to understand how the brain works, right? But what does that even mean? Well, a more proximal version of that question is we'd like to understand how the connectivity and dynamics of a neural circuit gives rise to behavior. And also, sorry, I'm having some issues where this thing doesn't, let me share. For some reason, my slides don't advance sometimes. Okay, let's see if that works. Okay, that's not working. All right. Stop sharing. Get out of here. Okay. Let me try this again. Try sharing this. Okay, and let's see. Slide. Okay, that's working again. All right. Hopefully that won't cause a bug again later. Okay, so learning is also important. So we'd like to understand how neural activity and synaptic learning rules can work together to self-organize useful connectivity that observes behavior. So what's interesting is the field of machine learning has generated lots of neural networks that accomplish interesting functions, functions that we know of no other way of accomplishing in any artificial system. What's a bit scary is we know everything about them. We know their connectivity, their dynamics, their learning rule, their entire developmental experience, yet we don't have a meaningful understanding of how they learn and work. And I think trying to arrive at such a meaningful understanding can both help us design better algorithms in artificial intelligence, as well as design better experiments in neuroscience. Okay, so it seems like whenever somebody enters, I cannot advance my slides. So let me try something else. I'm not gonna make my screen large. So let me share my desktop. Okay, and I can just use this to go down my slides. Okay, great. So hopefully you can still see it. Okay, so we've been working on kind of a mixture of work between theoretical neuroscience and machine learning, and this is sort of a collection of papers that we've kind of developed over the last few years. what's really interesting, I know from the perspective of a mathematics institute, what's really interesting is that you can actually profitably apply interesting and deep ideas from mathematics and theoretical physics to get some insights into artificial neural networks, and sometimes even use those insights to develop better algorithms. So we've used ideas like non-equilibrium stat mech, dynamic mean field theory, system mechanics of random landscapes, even Riemannian geometry, random matrix theory, and free probability theory to derive insights into how artificial neural networks work. If you're interested in kind of an overview of some of our recent work and the work of others, we wrote annual reviews of condensed matter physics on the statistical mechanics of deep learning, and we summarize sort of a bunch of work here if you're interested. I think this is a reasonable entry point into that work. So I can't clearly talk about all of this stuff. So I chose a selection of things that I thought might be of interest to different members of this audience in different ways. So first, I wanted to start off with shallow learning, just a very basic statistical procedure, which is regression, especially in high dimensions. What is the best way to do regression in high dimensions? So I'll talk about that first. Then I'll talk about generalization. How can neural networks predict the response to new examples that they haven't been trained on before? That's, of course, a very timely topic in machine learning at the moment. Then I'll talk about developing interpretable models of the brain through model reduction. Once you have a complex model, how do you understand it? How do you reduce its complexity? And can you gain insights into the physical or biological system that model was intended to describe? And so I'll talk about some work that we did on the retina there. And then I'll talk about recent work on how we explain the existence of hexagonal grid cells in the brain that are found in the brain. And also just talk very briefly about some very recent work that we've done in quantum neuromorphic computing with atoms and photons, where we work with these quantum systems of atoms and photons, especially in cavity quantum electrodynamics, where the classical limit of the dynamics can be shown to be equivalent to the dynamics of a neural network, an artificial neural network. And we're interested in understanding how the quantum dynamics generalizes away from that. Okay, so this talk has the advantage of being modular. If one part doesn't make sense, you can reset when we get to the next part. And hopefully there'll be a little something for everyone in here. Okay, so let's talk about regression in high dimensions, okay? So what does high dimensional statistics mean? It has a well-defined kind of limiting definition. The basic idea is there's been a revolution in the way that we do experiments across many, many different fields, driven by the advent of high throughput technologies that allow us to record many, many variables at once, right? So here's an example of classical data, where if you let sort of n be the dimensionality of your data and m be the number of data points that you measure, here we're just measuring two variables simultaneously. So each data point is a point in two-dimensional space. And we have lots and lots of them, right? So it's easy to do regression. It's easy to find clusters and so forth. Okay. So on the other hand, in high dimensional statistics, what's happening is the dimensionality of your data is becoming large. The number of data points is becoming large, but their ratio is order one. So a classical example is you record thousands of neurons in the brain of an animal. You don't know ahead of time whether those 1,000 neurons are relevant for describing the task at hand. But you don't get to measure that many trials because an animal has limited stamina to do the experiment. So you might have hundreds of trials where each trial involves the simultaneous activity of thousands of neurons. So this is a situation where both the dimensionality, the number of data points is large, but their ratio is order one, right? And this is the high dimensional statistics setting. And we'd like to understand the behavior of algorithms in this limit. It may seem that in this limit, it's almost impossible to discover structure and data without hallucinating spurious structure that you might find by chance by finding needles and haystacks in high dimensional spaces. But it turns out if you assume some underlying notions of simplicity in your data, you can actually accurately find structure in your data, assuming those assumptions are true. So the way that we're going to analyze high dimensional machine learning algorithms is we're going to exploit an analogy to statistical mechanics, where oftentimes when you do maximum likelihood, you're maximizing the probability of the data given your parameters of your statistical model, where the parameters of your statistical model are the degrees of freedom to be optimized. You can equate minus log probability with energy, and then the data which you're stuck with, which is what's given to you, plays the role of quench disorder in the sense of statistical mechanics. And then the parameters that you're optimizing over represent thermal degrees of freedom. And so by exploiting this analogy, we can use ideas from statistical mechanics to analyze the behavior of algorithms that involve, say, for example, maximum likelihood estimation. Okay, so let's see. If you're interested in high dimensional statistics and the connections to physics, we actually wrote a review article on this a while ago, where we used ideas from replica theory to describe in a unified way learning in perceptrons, random matrix theory, random dimensional reduction, compressed sensing, and other topics. So that might be, for people with a physics background, that might be a good starting point to look into this. Okay, so the very specific problem that we're going to be looking at is, again, regression. Okay, so here's the basic idea. Assume that you have inputs to this unknown system. Okay, this unknown system has a set of ground truth parameters, S0. It's a vector of ground truth parameters. And you can feed an input X mu, right? And you can get an output Y mu that's corrupted by noise. The functional relationship between the input and output is mediated by this unknown regression vector or ground truth vector through the relationship Y mu equals X mu dot S0 plus epsilon mu. So you could think of this just as a very simple linear neuron where you don't know the weights of the neuron. The unknown weights are S0, okay? Now, you don't get to observe this unknown regression vector. You have to infer it from measurements of the inputs and outputs of the system. So the ground truth vector generates the y's when given the x's, and you get the pairs of inputs and outputs, x's and y's, and you have to estimate an S hat. Ideally, this S hat should be close to this S0. Okay. Now, how are we going to estimate this S hat given the input-output data of the system? Well, you have a machine for doing this, which can be described by a loss function and a regularizer. All right. So the idea is you input the data to this machine and it spits out an estimate of the regression vector. The machine is simply, you penalize so what you do is you search over all possible candidate signals. So I'm going to call S0 an unknown signal or regression vector, but equivalently. So you search through the space of unknown signals and you try to minimize the discrepancy between what you would have gotten, right, had you, if S were your unknown signal, right? So X dot S is what you would have gotten, without any noise. Y mu is what you actually got. And you try to minimize the discrepancy in the output measurement space between what you predict and what you actually got. Okay, so that's what the loss function does. And then you might try to regularize your unknown signal somehow using a regularization function. So, and now what is the figure of merit for how well you did? Well, we're just going to look at the L2 distance between the estimated signal and the ground truth signal, okay? And so, okay, something that's very, very important is the dimensions, right? So our unknown signal, S0, is a p-dimensional signal, okay? Its components are drawn IID from a known distribution, P sub S, or P for the probability distribution of the signal components. And there's P dimensions. And then there's N measurements, where the measurements are corrupted by noise. The noise is IID across the trials indexed by mu. And the noise is drawn from some noise distribution, P sub epsilon. And a very important parameter is the measurement density, the ratio of the number of measurements to the number of dimensions, right? In the classical limit, the measurement density is effectively infinite. You have a very large number of measurements and an order one dimensionality. But here we're interested in situations where N and P are both large, but their ratio is order one. So here's a fundamental question, right? If you're given the signal distribution, the noise distribution, and the measurement density, which loss function rho and which regularizer sigma should I use in order to minimize the squared error? That's the question we're setting ourselves to ask. Okay, so as usual with these Zoom things, I'm not getting any feedback from the audience. So Sergey, I'll rely, if somebody has like a question, feel free to interrupt directly or put it in chat. And maybe Sergey, you can relay questions in the chat because I can't see the chat.
Yeah, I will look at the chart, and people can just unmute themselves if you're fine with that.
Yeah. I don't mind being interrupted at all. I'd much rather not finish the talk and be clear than finish the talk and be unclear. Okay, so that's the setting of the the problem. Okay. Now, just to give you some examples of loss functions and regularizers that some of you may be quite familiar with, it turns out a lot of well-known famous algorithms for regression fall into this basic framework, right? Where you have a particular loss function regularizer. So for example, if your loss function is just the squared function, right? Then this is just least squares, right? It's just least squares estimation. If your loss function is the minus log probability of the noise, i.e. the discrepancy between what you actually got and sorry, the discrepancy between what you actually got and the pristine measurement that you would make if your signal was S is related to the noise, right? So if you make your loss function the minus log probability of the noise distribution, then it turns out this becomes maximum likelihood estimation. If you have a squared loss and a squared regularizer, that's called ridge regression. Lasso is a squared loss and an L1 penalty on the regularizer. Elastic net is a squared loss and a combination of L1 and L2 penalties on the regularizer. And then map estimation, or maximum a posteriori inference, is you try to maximize you try to find the most likely signal given the posterior distribution over signals given your measurements. So that corresponds to the loss being the minus probability of the noise and the regularizer being the minus log probability of the signal. Okay, so there's sort of an embarrassment of riches for doing regression, corresponding to an embarrassment of riches in choosing the loss and the regularizer. We just like to understand which one is the best. Okay, and so what we did is we set this up as a statistical mechanics problem, right? So you can view this as a zero temperature kind of energy minimization where rho and sigma are related to your energy, x mu and y mu play the role of quench disorder. And we were able to just compute analytically the squared error of this minimizer as a function of the measurement density, the loss, the regularizer, and the noise distribution, the signal distribution. And then with this analytic expression in hand, we were able to optimize it by fixing the distribution of signal and noise, and doing a variational optimization over the loss function, the regularizer. And this is what we found. Okay, the details can be found in a paper in these papers here, but let me just tell you what we found. So here's an example. Okay, here's an example where the noise distribution is a Laplacian distribution, and the signal distribution is also a Laplacian distribution. What we find is that if the measurement density is very, very large, if you have many, many measurements relative to dimensions, then the optimal thing to do is indeed map estimation. That's this one here, where the loss and the regularizer are closely related to the noise and signal distributions respectively. Okay. On the other hand, as you reduce the measurement density, it turns out map is not the optimal thing to do, even if you have perfect knowledge of the signal and noise distributions. What you want to do is, in order to take into account the limited measurement density, you want to actually further regularize and smooth the map estimator in a particular way, and we provide the optimal way to smooth it. So it turns out as you lower the measurement density, you want a slightly smoother loss function and a smoother regularizer. And then in the limit, as you get to very little measurement densities, the level of smoothing is so much that you end up with a quadratic loss and a quadratic regularizer as the optimal thing to do. Okay. Now there's some technical constraints in our ability to do this analysis. In order to find the optimal loss and regularizer, we need to assume that the signal and noise are log concave distributed, right? So that's true, for example, of these Laplacian signals. This relates to a technical thing in our calculation that the effective cost function that needs to be minimized, or the equivalent energy function in the statistical mechanical system, leads to a replica symmetric solution. Okay, I'll just leave it at that. But the requirement of replica symmetry is what forces us to deal only with log concave signal and noise. But for any log concave signal and noise distribution, this story is true, that ridge becomes the optimal thing to do independent of the signal and noise distribution as long as it's log concave. So again, just to summarize, map is optimal at high measurement density, Ridge is optimal at low measurement density, independent of signal and noise. And it turns out that this optimal loss and regularizer actually achieve the Bayes optimal minimal mean squared error in the estimate of S hat. So then as a result, we can show that as well. And as a result, we can show that no inference algorithm whatsoever can outperform this optimal algorithm. Okay. So let me just show you the results and the match between theory and numerics. So again, this is for this example with the Laplacian signal and noise. These curves are the estimation error, the L2 error between S hat and S0. And the estimation error falls off. So the black is the optimal algorithm, which is a different loss and regularizer for every measurement density. And the optimal algorithm does, of course, every algorithm does better as you add more data. The optimal algorithm does the best. Okay, the red is map estimation. Map estimation approaches optimality as the measurement density becomes large, but it's actually suboptimal as the measurement density is small. The blue is ridge regression, quadratic loss and regularizer. And we show, as predicted, that ridge regression is close to optimal at low measurement density, and it does worse relative to optimal at high measurement density, and eventually it does actually worse than map. Okay, all solid curves are theoretical, are plots of theoretical expressions that we got from our statistical mechanics analysis, and the error bars are obtained from actually numerically solving the problem using that particular loss and regularizer. And you can see there's a nice match between theory and experiment. Okay, so basically, again, the take-home messages are the optimal thing to do depends on the amount of data that you have. The more data, the less data that you have, the more it actually pays to ignore the detailed distribution of signal and noise and retreat to quadratic loss and quadratic regularizer. Maybe explaining why ridge regression might be so prevalent and successful in high dimensions. Okay.
Hey, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So I was wondering why you care about the difference in the inferred parameter and true parameter, as opposed to, let's say, caring about generalization error on.
Yeah, that's a good question. In our setting, they're monotonically related to each other. Okay. So we could have easily, we also have expressions for the generalization error, and it's very simply related to this L2 error between S hat and S0.
I see. So you would like not assume that there's any model misspecification. So you assume data's, I guess, coming from always the right.
Yeah. So everything that we've done, all the theory that we've worked out is assuming the data comes from the model. Okay. So we're not dealing with model misspecification at all. Okay. That's a really important point.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So all right. So now let's go on to something a little bit deeper in the sense of deep networks, but just still one hidden layer. So this is the question of generalization. Okay. So this is joint work with Andrew Saxon, Andrew Lampinen, and Jay McClellan at Stanford, and this is the two papers that I'll be discussing. Okay, so the basic observation is that the learning dynamics of training and testing error when you train neural networks is actually quite complicated, right? So there are legions of people who are training deep neural networks to solve some task, and they observe these two curves, right? They observe the training error, how well you're doing on the training set as a function of time, and it often has these plateaus and sudden drops and plateaus and drops and so forth. And then the test error, which is how well you do on a held out test set that you don't have access to when you're training, right? And a key feature of these curves is that they can be non-monotonic. The test error can go down over time, maybe again with a plateau, but maybe later on it might rise, okay? And so this is called overfitting, where you overfit on the training examples and that leads to bad predictions of the new examples. Okay, so there's a lot of work on trying to understand when you have overfitting, when the test error can be small, and so forth. And what I wanted to do was there's a lot of sort of debate in the literature about what controls test error. And so what we wanted to do was we wanted to analytically compute both these training errors and the test errors as a function of time, completely analytically, in the simplest non-trivial example that we could find, okay? And it turns out, surprisingly, the simplest non-trivial, it's not surprising that it's simple, but it's surprising that it's non-trivial. is just a linear neural network. So again, the input is X, the output is Y, and Y is just the product of two weight matrices times X, okay? Of course, this is a terrible model for neural networks in terms of their expressive capacity because the composition of linear layers is linear, but it's an interesting model for the learning dynamics because if you think about a squared loss on the output, which is a desired output minus the actual output squared, then that loss is quartic in the weights, right? Because you have 2 powers of W through the feed-forward map, and you have a squared loss here. So your loss function is quartic in the weights. So when you do gradient descent on that loss function in the weights, you have a cubic term on the right-hand side. So your error landscape is non-convex, a gradient descent is nonlinear, and so it has the capacity for having some richness. Okay, so we actually, despite the fact that the learning dynamics is nonlinear, we found exact solutions to the learning dynamics. And they were, you can express them in the following form. Okay, so you might ask, what drives learning in the system, right? So you're feeding in a set of inputs and you have a set of outputs, okay? Because the network is linear and the loss is squared, the statistics of inputs and outputs that drive learning are simply 2 correlation matrices. The input correlation matrix, which is, for example, the matrix of correlations between the activity of, say, neuron 1 and neuron 4 here, right, average across the data set, and the input-output correlation matrix, the correlation between, say, one neuron in the output and another neuron in the input, averaged over the data set. So I'm calling these the input correlation matrix sigma 1, 1, and the input-output correlation matrix sigma 3, 1. Okay. If you write down the gradient descent dynamics and the limit of low learning rates and so forth, you get a set of ordinary differential equations that are of this form. And as promised, they're cubic in the weights on the right-hand side. Okay, but they're simple in terms of the statistics of the data. They're driven by the input correlation matrix and the input-output correlation matrix. Right? Okay, so these are the equations. What are the solutions to these equations? It turns out you can express solutions, at least for a simple set of initial conditions, as the following. What you can show, and again, for simplicity, I'm going to assume that the input correlations are white. So oftentimes we whiten the data before we apply supervised learning to the data. So I'm going to assume that sigma 1, 1 is the identity matrix, so it drops out. And then sigma 3, 1 is what drives everything, the input-output correlation matrix. So it turns out when we found our exact solutions, we found out that the product of weights across the layers, what it does intuitively is it builds up the singular value decomposition of the input-output correlation matrix, sigma 3, 1. So for example, this is an exact solution to the weight trajectory here. U alpha and V alpha are the input and the output and input singular vectors of the matrix sigma 3, 1. Right? And this A is a time-dependent singular value that has this particular sigmoidal learning curve, okay? Where S is the associated singular value. S is the associated singular value associated with the singular modes U alpha and V alpha, okay? So this time-dependent singular value happens to have a sigmoidal shape over time. So this is training time. This is a plot of the singular of the time-dependent singular value of the network that's being learned, and it's a function that's, if you start with small weights, it starts at a small value, and it undergoes a sigmoidal transition to a large value, right? And that large value as t goes to infinity is simply just S, right? So, which is the singular value of the input-output correlation matrix, S alpha here, right? And the time it makes that transition occurs at a time that's order 1 over S. So basically what happens is the largest singular mode in the input-output correlation matrix gets learned first. The second largest singular mode gets learned later. And the third largest singular mode gets learned even later, right? And the timing of over which each singular mode gets learned is order 1 over S. So the basic take-home message is stronger statistical structure in your data gets learned earlier, okay? That statement, however vague it might be, presumably generalizes to nonlinear deep neural networks. We just don't know how to quantify the strength of statistical structure in data and to quantify when it gets learned. But in the linear setting, both are easy to quantify. Strength of statistical structure is precisely the singular value of the input-output correlation matrix, and the time of learning is 1 over that singular value. Okay, so that's what these neural networks do when they're exposed to training data. These things can be generalized to multi-layer networks, and we've done that as well. But I wanted you to think about, to set up the problem of generalization, I wanted you to think about the problem, the learning dynamics in a certain way, right? So here I talked about, what's the amplitude with which a particular singular mode has been learned at a particular time. But I could also ask you to fix the time and ask you which singular modes in the training data have been learned and which have not been learned, right? And so here's an example of the sigmoidal learning curve S as a function of time, and now S hat is the singular value in the training data. And here are these sigmoidal learning curves where stronger singular values get learned earlier. But I could also view this as a function of the singular values of the data and ask at a given fixed time, what's the ratio of the amount of singular value that's been learned relative to the actual singular value in the data. And that function looks like a wave traveling in from right to left as time goes forward. So at a certain intermediate time, all singular modes with the singular value larger than some threshold have been learned, but singular modes with a smaller value have not been learned. And as time sweeps forward, the wave penetrates into smaller and smaller singular values and picks them up, okay? So basically, again, at time t, modes with singular value S hat given larger than t over some normalized time are learned, and modes with a smaller than that time are not yet learned, okay? All right, now let's talk about generalization, okay? So to talk about generalization, I have to have a model of what the problem is, right? I think that personally, that's one of the deepest impediments to doing theory and deep learning, is we don't have a mathematical description of the task that we're asking our neural networks to do, right? We don't have a mathematical characterization of what a cat is in the set of images, right? Ironically, generative models for cats are our current best mathematical model of what cats are in images. So we have to have a mathematical model of the task in order to develop a theory of generalization. So we're going to take what's an old time-honored technique called teacher-student learning, right? Where basically we're going to assume that the task is defined by a teacher neural network with ground truth weights given by these W bars, okay? Of course, the detailed decomposition, we're going to assume the teacher is a linear neural network, so the detailed decomposition into W12 and W23 doesn't matter. It's only the product that matters, okay? I'm going to assume that the teacher neural network gets random inputs and it spits out outputs. So if X hat mu is an input, W bar X hat mu is the output, okay? And, but it's also going to be corrupted by noise. So there's noise at the output, okay? So this is my model for how the training data is generated, okay? Now, I'm going to assume that there's a student neural network here that's only getting access to the training data generated by the teacher. And by observing the inputs to the teacher and the outputs from the teacher, it has to figure out the weights of the teacher, okay? So it doesn't get access to W bar, it gets access to the X hats and the Y hats, okay? Now I'm gonna work in a setting where the teacher is extremely simple. It's a low rank teacher. So for example, the number of input neurons N1 and the number of output neurons N3 could be large, but the number of hidden neurons is order 1. Okay. And the student I can assume is full rank. So the student is much more complicated than the teacher, right? One of the mysteries of deep learning is why very, very complicated over-parameterized networks with many, many parameters can still generalize well on data sets of limited size. So here's an example of a student that has lots more parameters than the teacher. Okay. So we've already studied how the student responds to training data, right? We know that the input correlation matrix and the input output correlation matrix are what drive learning in the student, right? So we know how the learned weights of the student will behave in response to these matrices. Again, we're going to assume that the inputs have been whitened for us, okay? So it's really this matrix that matters, right? We studied in the previous slides how the weights build up the singular value decomposition of this matrix. But of course, this matrix hides within it in a relatively inaccessible manner the true weights of the teacher that we'd like to learn, right? It turns out if you just work out very simple linear algebra, the input-output correlation matrix of training data generated from this teacher looks like the low-ranked teacher matrix perturbed by a noise matrix, okay? So what's happening is we're feeding the student a low-rank matrix plus a noise matrix. The student is going to build up the singular value decomposition of W bar plus C, but what we care about is the singular value decomposition of W bar, right? And that's what's going to determine generalization. So to really understand generalization in the setting, we need to understand how the singular mode structure of low-rank matrices are perturbed by noise. Okay, that's what we have to figure out. Fortunately, that's been worked out in the random matrix theory literature. And so let me review that, okay? So I'm going to call sigma 3, 1, I'm going to call it singular value decomposition, a sum over S hat alpha, U hat alpha, V hat alpha. So you can think of these as the corrupted singular values that the student network will be able to learn, okay? But the pristine singular values and singular vectors of the teacher, I'm going to call S bar alpha, U bar alpha, and V bar alpha, right? These are the clean singular modes that the student only has indirect access to from the noisy inputs and outputs of the teacher, okay? So a basic question is, what is the relationship between the corrupted singular vectors and the pristine clear singular vectors, okay? And the answer has been given by random matrix theorists, Florent and Rajrao. So here's the basic idea. It of course depends on the details, right? Some details. It depends on how large the singular values of the teacher are, right? Clearly, if the singular value, or intuitively, if the singular values of the teacher are quite large, then adding a little bit of noise won't corrupt the singular vectors at all. And it turns out there's a phase transition in this problem. So it turns out that if we plot the overlap or dot product between the corrupted singular vector and the clean singular vector as a function of the singular value of the teacher for a fixed level of noise, it turns out if the singular value is very, very small, the overlap will be 0, right? But as soon as there's a transition, the overlap will become, as soon as the singular value of the teacher becomes larger than the threshold, there's a phase transition and the overlap acquires a non-trivial value. And of course, it saturates to 1 if the singular value of the teacher is large, okay? What happens to the spectrum of this thing? So let's say W bar were a very simple rank 3 matrix. Then it would have a clean singular value that has a clean spectrum that has 3 non-trivial singular values. If you add the noise, you build up a noise spectrum here, and the singular values get inflated. So S bar goes to S hat alpha through this inflation function. This is S hat as a function of S bar. And you can see that it's quite inflated, and then it approaches the unity line. Okay? So that's basically what happens. That's how that's how the teacher is buried in the training data that's presented to the student, okay? So now we can, and there are mathematical formulas for all of this, so now we can combine these mathematical formulas with our previous mathematical formulas for neural network training, and we can get a very simple, clear story of what's going on, okay? So here's an example where the teacher is rank 1, okay? The student is rank n, and they both have 1 hidden layer. Oh, by the way, we can generalize this to multiple hidden layers. I'll tell you about that next. But so these are the training curves for the students. Okay, so you always start off at high error, and there's a sudden drop, then there's a plateau, and then there's a slow drop. Okay. And there's a match between theory and experiment. Theory and experiment fall on top of each other. For the test error, it's a different story. There's a sudden drop in the test error, and then there's a rise in the test error later on in time. And this is varying the signal to noise ratio, which is roughly the strength of the teacher's singular mode relative to the noise. Okay. Okay, there's an optimal early stopping time at which you achieve the best possible test error. And it turns out the test error at the optimal early stopping time we can compute analytically, and it's completely independent of the number of hidden units of the student. It depends on the structure of the data, not on the student architecture. And most notably, it depends on the signal to noise ratio in the data. Okay. So this is a match between theory and numerics for 5 layers or 3 hidden layers, and you get a similar picture there. We've also analyzed, we've also compared to nonlinear networks. So we held all parameters the same, but we just switched from linear networks to rectified linear networks, which is the most popular nonlinear in deep learning. And you get a qualitatively similar structure here. So this is kind of this behavior for this problem is robust to the nonlinearity. I'm going to skip this because this is a little bit technical. Okay, now why do we see this behavior? What's going on intuitively? All right. Let's go back to the singular mode detection wave that I talked about here. So what's going on in terms of this thing? So if we think about this as the spectrum of our training data, right, that's derived from a putative, say, rank 3 teacher that has 3 signal singular values. In reality, to match to this thing, you should imagine that there's really only 1 outlier singular value here. So, but what's happening is, as a student learns, there's that singular mode detection wave that's sweeping out from large values to small values. And as that wave crosses over a singular mode, it picks up that singular mode and learns it, right? Now we know from the random matrix theory, the large singular modes have some information about the teacher, i.e. the overlap between U hat and U is non-trivial. So then once that singular mode is swept over, both the training error and the testing error drop. Okay? But at a later time, the singular mode detection wave penetrates into this Marcinko-Pasteur C associated with the noise in the training data. Once you penetrate the C, you learn about the training data, you fit the training data better, but you don't learn anything about the teacher because you're in this regime where U hat and U bar have no overlap. So as you penetrate this Marcinko-Pasteur C, the training error drops in a continuous fashion because you're continuously penetrating the C, but the test error rises in this continuous fashion. Okay? So that kind of gives you a kind of a visceral picture of the process of learning and overfitting. Okay? Here we can show that if you train on random data, you learn slower than if you train on structured data. This was one of the observations or mysterious observations that was noted in this paper that kind of started off the process of rethinking generalization in deep learning. So let me, so here's sort of, actually, let me just summarize with the take-home summary. Okay, so basically, we analytically computed the training and test error as a function of training time in deep linear networks. The results qualitatively reflect learning in deep nonlinear nets on the same data sets. The generalization error as a function of time depends in a sensitive but completely computable way on the initial student weights, those matter, the rank of the teacher and the signal to noise ratio in the teacher. But it doesn't, the generalization error at the optimal early stopping time does not depend at all on the student network size, as long as you start it from small weights, and as long as the student has a high enough rank to be expressive enough to capture the teacher. So the number of parameters, which is what many people have been paying attention to, doesn't matter one bit, okay? The reason the number of parameters doesn't matter one bit is that these networks learn the most important structure in the data first, and then only later learn less important structure. So the entire kind of non-equilibrium training trajectory really matters, okay? That explains why learning scrambled data takes longer than learning structured data. And this tells us that any attempt to bound generalization error in terms of the student network architecture or the complexity of the student network alone is likely to yield a loose bound. So all of the, I didn't have time to go into this, but all of these bounds based on VC dimension, Rademacher complexity, and so forth, they're probably doomed to fail because they fail even in the simple setting, right? So to understand generalization, we need a theory of the structure of the data and its relation to the generalizable problem that it summarizes, and its impact on the learning dynamics. And I suspect this is a generalizable lesson, is that generalization in deep learning the success of generalization may originate through a conspiracy of structure and data and the learning dynamics of deep networks. So I think it becomes a much more complex non-equilibrium problem than we might have initially given it credit for. Okay. I won't have time to do anything more than advertise this, but we actually use similar ideas to explain the dynamics of infant semantic cognitive development. Infants make these characteristic pattern of learning over time. Neural networks also show those same patterns of learning over time. And we can explain analytically why these patterns arise even in simple linear neural networks. So we were able to surprisingly model a large range of phenomena in infant cognitive development using the nonlinear learning dynamics in deep linear networks. And this just appeared in PNAS recently. Okay, so let's, so I realize I have 10 minutes left. So, but in any case, I was planning on doing these in much less detail, actually. Let me just summarize this one, and I'll stop after that. So, okay, so this is a problem that keeps me up at night, especially as we start to use more complex neural networks as models of the brain. Okay, so we've experienced a lot of success in neuroscience where we train neural networks to solve a task. And it turns out their internal representations look like those in neural circuits that are trained to solve that same task, right? So we train a monkey to solve a task. We train an artificial neural network to solve a task. The internal dynamics of an artificial neural network look a lot like that of the monkey, okay? But these models are quite complex. So are we simply replacing something we don't understand, i.e. the brain, with something else that we don't understand, a deep neural network? Moreover, beyond representations are the very computational mechanisms or intermediate steps that are used to generate those representations the same in the model and the brain? And how do we generate mechanistic hypotheses to guide experiments in neuroscience to probe the interior structure and function of biological circuits? Okay. So we did a body of work on this, again, with an amazing team on the retina, okay? So the retina is actually already a one hidden layer neural network. So in the retina, you can shine light on the photoreceptors and record from the ganglion cells. And each of us have about 1 million optic nerve fibers or ganglion cells, and everything we know about the visual world comes from those 1 million fibers. And it has a hidden layer of bipolar cells with lateral connections to horizontal cells and other lateral connections through amacrine cells. So this is a hidden layer. It's hard to record from this hidden layer, but it's easy to shine light on the retina and record from the ganglion cells. Now, the classical model of the retina is simply you model the response of one of these ganglion cells in terms of a spatiotemporal stimulus through a spatiotemporal filter and a rectifying nonlinearity. Now, these models mimic well the response of the system to white noise, especially low resolution white noise, but they don't mimic the response of the system to natural movies, which are the very stimuli that sculpted the evolution of our retina, right? So we decided to go one step further, and we decided to model the retina using a two-layer convolutional neural network. Now, there might be many reasons to think this is a terrible idea. One is we don't have Google's amount of data. We can only record from a retina for about an hour. So we might not have enough data to fit the model. Two, even if we could succeed, the interior structure of the model may not look anything like the retina. Three, even if it resembled it, the intermediate sequence of computational steps might not look anything like what the retina does. And four, it might not generalize to completely different stimuli. Okay, it turned out all four of these concerns, luckily for us, turned out to be completely unfounded. We were able to succeed in all four of these settings, okay? This slide just summarizes that we do better than everyone else, and we get up to a level of accuracy set by intrinsic limits on stochasticity and retinal dynamics itself. Let me not bore you with that. I'll try to get to the most interesting part for this audience. It turns out if you look inside our model, the neurons inside our model turn out to be a pretty good model for the neurons inside the retina, okay? Despite the fact that it didn't have to be that way. Here's an example of a more difficult experiment where they recorded from a bipolar cell in the interior of another retina. And we found the best matching neuron in our model. And the black is the data, and the purple is the model, and you can see there's a nice fit. And if you measure the spatial temporal filters in our model, they look quantitatively like the spatial temporal filters of these bipolar cells in the retina. Okay, but this I think is the most interesting part. Okay, so there's been decades of work before we knew how to model the retinal response to natural movies. There's been decades of work trying to model the retinal response to simpler structured stimuli like moving bars, moving dots, and so forth. And these were actually really interesting pieces of work that discovered very interesting nonlinear properties in the retina, right? And so a question is, are the retinal computations elicited by these artificial stimuli at all relevant to the retinal computations elicited by natural stimuli? Okay, and what we find is that our CNNs trained only on natural movies generalized to all 8 of these artificial stimuli, and they're able to reproduce all of these phenomena that have kind of played out in the retinal literature over a couple of decades of work. So this one model could reproduce responses that underlied a decade or so of work. And just to show you how weird these responses are, right? I mean, this is just some fun phenomenology if you haven't ever looked at the retina, just independently of our work. Our retina actually behaves as the first step of a predictive model of the world. That's actually quite remarkable. So what's evidence for that kind of statement? If you show, for example, a periodic flash to the retina, right? Of course, the retina will entrain and respond to that periodic flash. But if you emit a flash, it will complain a lot at exactly the right time at which it's supposed to complain, when that flash was supposed to come. And it'll do that for a range of frequencies, okay? Motion reversal. If a bar is moving from left to right, retinal cells will respond to the bar. But if it suddenly reverses, all of the retinal cells whose receptive fields were near the reversal will complain a lot. Okay? It's as if the retina knows about Newton's first law of motion. Objects that are in motion will tend to remain in motion. And when Newton's first law is violated, it complains a lot. Here, when a periodic structure is violated, it complains a lot. Also, object segregating local motion from global motion, right? If you move your eyes across if you move your eyes, the entire world moves across your retina, but you don't feel like the world is moving, right? That problem is begun to be solved in the retina. There are cells where if the center moves, say left to right, and the surround moves right to left out of phase, then these cells will fire a lot. But if the center and surround move in phase, so there's only global motion, it will not fire a lot, right? So again, the retina acts as this remarkable predictive engine, right? And you might ask, like, how does the retina do this? Well, our model, this very complicated neural network model, I didn't show you the data, but you can see in the paper that it actually reproduces all 3 of these weird phenomena, and more generally, all 8 of them, which I didn't go into. So this leads to a really interesting question, right? We have this very complicated model, and you have this very striking qualitative feature. Why did the retina complain here? Why did it complain here? Why does it fire here and not here? How can we extract qualitative answers from a quantitative model, and actually more really quantitative models that can get all of this? So we were able to do this through a method of model reduction, right? So the basic idea is we started from this complicated model, and we used ideas from machine learning called attribution theory. For any given stimulus, we tried to carve out the most important the most important neurons that are responsible for generating the response at any particular time. So what we're able to do is we're able to say, if you give me a stimulus and you ask, why did the neuron fire here? I can tell you the reason why it fired was because this subset of neurons transmitted the signal to this subset of neurons and then caused the firing. Okay, we have an algorithmic way of doing that. And just to make a long story short, when we did that, we were able to take our model, and for each of these weird stimuli, we were able to extract a much simpler model with maybe 1 or 2 neurons or 1 or 2 subunits that could explain the retinal response to each of these weird stimuli. Now, these stimuli have been studied in the past, so people have done experiments on the retina trying to figure out models of each of these responses piecemeal. And so we could compare the model that we extracted as a subset of this large model to previously published literature, and we found a very nice match between all of them. For the emitted stimulus response, there was never any model that could get all of the responses correct. It turns out our model can, and it yields a very simple 3-pathway nonlinear model where these pathways can be associated with bipolar cells. So it yields a very simple testable prediction. Okay, so this kind of turns the process of doing neuroscience on its head, right? Rather than showing one stimulus at a time to the brain and having a body of literature for how does the brain respond to this stimulus, to this stimulus, to this stimulus, to this stimulus, we throw the kitchen sink at the brain, we throw the kitchen sink model to model the data, and then we work backwards to find reduced models that explain interesting, important stimuli that we care about. And so this was published just last year at NeurIPS. And you can find all of the details of how we did that here. So let me just stop. I just wanted to advertise, again, for this crowd, we've started some new work on quantum neuromorphic computing, where, and this is on the archive, it's under review right now, where we were able to implement hot field associative memory networks in cavity quantum electrodynamic systems. Effective dynamics of the atomic, so the atomic spins behave like neurons and the photons behave like synapses. We're able to extract the effective dynamics of the system, and we showed that it yielded a steepest descent dynamics that can do better than the hot field network itself in terms of memory capacity. And we're also trying to understand this recurrent ice machine. I'll just stop there. And here are the references. Thanks. So I'm happy to take questions if you have time, I guess.
Thank you, Surya. While people are gathering their thoughts, a quick question from me. I'm a little bit puzzled. How does a static convolutional neural network captures the dynamics like reverse mode?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we did is the first layer of the neural network had spatiotemporal filters, right? So we would feed a small segment of a movie, about 300 or so milliseconds, which corresponds to the temporal filtering time constant of the actual biological retina. And the first layer weights were spatiotemporal. And then after that, the subsequent weights were spatial.
Okay. Thank you. I do not see any questions in the chat. Please just unmute yourself and ask your question directly.
Hello, Surya. This is Cengiz.
Hi, Cengiz.
How are you? Yeah, sorry, can't turn on my video on. I missed, in your retina model, what was the training data?
Yeah, so we gathered training data from the salamander retina in Steve Backus's lab, and it corresponded to natural movies played to the salamander retina. And we collected the recordings of about 20 ganglion cells for 1 hour. And so the final, actually, can I, so the reason we were able to fit the model is these weights were shared amongst the 20 ganglion cells. And these so these are the 20 ganglion cells that were measured. These weights are specific to each ganglion cell. So effectively 20 hours of data were contributing to these weights and 1 hour of data was contributing to these weights. Right? And so because of that weight sharing, presumably we could fit the model.
Okay. Thank you.
Surya, when you were talking about your linear model that did SVD decomposition,
yeah,
you were arguing strongly that what the network really discovers is the structure of the data, and that's really what's going on. And then I wonder, when an eye discovers the structure, discovers those Gabor Gabor filters, is it really entirely due to the structure of the data, or does it have to do also with the loss function, with the learning algorithm that implicitly works there?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So there was seminal work by Olshausen and Field back in the day where they were able to show that sparse coding of natural scenes learns Gabor filters. So there, both the structure of the data and the algorithm play a role. They conspire together. And the key was you're trying to find sparse variables whose activities explain the natural image patches. And it turns out that if you project natural image patches onto Gabor filters, the resulting projection has a highly kurtotic or sparse distribution. And so they fit together like a hand in glove. Just really quickly, we were able to explain the structure of the primate retina using convolutional autoencoders. So this is the actual spatial temporal receptive fields of the 4 dominant cell types in the primate retina. This is spatial receptive field, this is the temporal receptive field gathered from data in E.J. Chichilinsky's lab. This is what you would get if you assume that the primate retina was autoencoding spatial temporal movies with an optimal autoencoder. And we get a very nice quantitative match there. Yeah, that was one of the things I was going to talk about, but I had guessed that I wouldn't have time to get to it. But anyway, the details are in this paper. So there's actually a long body of work on efficient coding of natural movies that shows that if you optimally process natural movies, you can recover stuff that you see in the brain in visual circuits. But nobody before had been able to explain the different cell types that occur in the primate retina. And so this is this was the first work to do that.
So basically what you're saying is that the system itself adjusts to the data and then it will come up with the optimal loss function and vaguely speaking, an optimal learning algorithm to learn what's in the data.
Yeah. So we
know
know,
enough, basically.
Yeah. So we do know that like learning and experience with the world is required to learn, say, orientation and edge detectors. So we do believe that the brain is learning those from the data. We don't know exactly which algorithm we do, but now a lot of algorithms, if you train them on visual tasks, the earliest layers will look like Gabor filters. There was kind of a phase transition in the field where before Olshausen and Field and also Tommy Bell, nobody could learn edge detectors from images. But then once there was one way to do it, there were many ways to do it. But we do believe the brain is learning it. We don't exactly know the exact algorithm.
Hey, I had a kind of converse question. Is there any documented case where the early layers like don't learn Gabor filters, or is this just always the case? Like, have there been any experiments where, let's say, mice?
Okay, yeah, we have a paper on that. Okay, so here's an interesting question, right? So actually, I don't have the paper on my slides, but here's an interesting question. Here I'm showing you that the optimal filters, if you do autoencoding of natural movies, just with a linear autoencoder or with a rectified linear autoencoder, you get these circularly symmetric receptive fields, right?
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if you use sparse coding, you get edge filters. On the other hand, if you do like supervised learning on ImageNet, the first things that you get are Gabor filters. You don't usually get these circular receptive fields. So what gives? Why do you get circular receptive fields in the retina and sparse or edge filters in the visual cortex? In some other work, Stefan Denis is also an author, on that work. We just ask a very basic question. What if you have a model where there's a retina or a first layer, let's not call it a retina yet. You have a first layer, then you have a bottleneck layer. So you go to a very, very small number of neurons, like the 1 million optic nerve fibers of the brain. Of course, we had many fewer than that. But then it expands to a larger layer, just like the optic nerve fibers expand to many more neurons in V1. And then you train it on some supervised learning task. Then the first layer learns circularly symmetric receptive fields, and the second layer, after the bottle, everything before the bottleneck is circularly symmetric, and everything after the bottleneck is a Gabor filter. So it may just be that if you have to compress things, then you do circularly symmetric filters. If you have to sparse code things, or if you have lots of capacity, you learn edge filters. We don't have a mathematical theory of that. That's just an empirical observation where we train stuff.
Could you point me to this paper? Is this paper out already?
Yeah, it was in iClear a couple. Let's see, is it in my? I don't think it's in my bibliography. I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. I can look for
It's
it.
on
Thank
our
you.
it's on our lab website. If you search for Stéphane Denis on my lab website pages, you should be able to get to it.
Thanks.
It's a nice talk.
Oh, hi, Xingtang. Yeah.
Yeah. Come more often.
Oh, my pleasure. I spent so many years studying your manifolds. So,
Oh yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it would be nice to apply some of the things to you. I like to study more carefully.
Sure.
It's very nice.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good.
Could I ask one more question? Is that time?
Yeah.
So yeah. So when you talked about these linear networks, you said, I mean, yeah, if for the if the networks were nonlinear, you wouldn't know how to describe the data structure. So you wouldn't know what aspects of data structure would be learned first.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's $1 million question.
Is there an NTK version of this you could think of? Maybe, I don't know, like
Yeah. We just had a paper at the period in Europe this year. It's on the archive where we looked at NTK actually. So just to bring everyone up to speed. So in the limit of infinite width, these neural networks become much easier to analyze. The weights don't move very much, and you can think about, if you think about the manifold of weights, so if you think about the manifold of functions in function space realizable by changing the weights of the neural network, in the infinite width limit, you never really leave the tangent space associated with with where you started from. So the learning dynamics is linear in that tangent space. We actually showed that in settings used in practice, you actually leave the tangent space very, very far. So I don't think the NTK limit is a good limit for describing what actually goes on in practice. Now, having said that, in the NTK limit, people have come up with an effective theory of what neural networks are doing in the NTK limit, and they're basically just learning a Gaussian process with a particular kernel, right? So they're basically smoothing the labels of the data over input space using a certain kernel for a measure of similarity.
Yeah, and so we have some work along these lines too. So if you look at actually eigen functions of these kernels, it turns out those guys have, you can define some preference of like.
Yeah, exactly. The dominant eigenmodes of those kernels tell you how the network is willing to generalize, right?
Right.
So yeah, exactly. I think understanding those. But so what we showed is that we computed the velocity of motion of that kernel, and we showed that within the first few epochs, it moves very, very rapidly. And then if you train using a data-dependent NTK, you do much, much better than the NTK obtained initialization, even if the data-dependent NTK is obtained within 3 epochs of learning.
Interesting.
So basically, like within 3 epochs, you pick up a lot of structure in the training data. So computing the eigenmodes of trained NTK kernels is a really good problem to work on.
I see. Oh,
if you guys have already computed those eigenmodes, I mean, it's not hard to do it, but yeah, it might be fun to think about that together.
Interesting. All right. Well, thank you.
And especially understanding how they're different from the ones at initialization, right? Because now the data structure has entered the system. So it might provide a good purchase to understand what aspects of the data are seeping into the kernel in the first three or so epochs.
That's very true. And like, yeah, I would like to follow up. I mean, we've been thinking about these things.
That'd be fun to discuss, Cengiz. That'd be great. I'd be happy to discuss.
Sure. Yeah. Good to see you. Okay.
Yeah, good to see you, quote unquote, seeing you as well.
Any more questions? Okay, then we will finish our colloquium. I will stop recording now. Thank you very much for the talk. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. It's a very nice talk.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Great. So yeah, thanks for organizing.